Everything.
See you Zoom.
Netflix.
Okay. Welcome, dear audience on campus and online. This micro. Too much instructions. So welcome, dear audience on campus and online. First of all, I have to apologize to the Dean who had other commitments, but on behalf of her, I welcome you in the Faculty of Design Sciences for what promises to be an exciting evening lecture. The Faculty of Design Sciences hosts several design disciplines from product development to architecture, heritage studies, but all united in, I think, going for a better world, to improve the world. And in this regard, I think we are extremely honored to be able to invite such an renowned writer, professor of architecture theory and history among us tonight, Antoine Pico. But first, I give the word to Erin Schreurs, who will explain how the evening will function and further introduce our excellent speaker.
Thank you, Johan. No problem. Ik denk dat je gewoon nog een keer moet. Let's just assume this works. And otherwise, we're just happily oblivious. My pleasure to introduce Antoine Picon. As a professor of history of architecture and technology since 2002, and the director of the doctoral programs at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, also being chairman of the Foundation of Le Corbusier, and trained as engineer and architect and art historian. And in this triple capacity, has written extensively on the history of architecture and urban technologies from the 18th century to the present, with a focus on France. And his recent research interest, and this is so one of the reasons why we invite him, concern the arrival of digital culture and how this affects our discipline from the city to the detail. In this light, we can also see his most recent work called The Materiality of Architecture, on which he will speak this evening. In this book, he discusses materiality that he defines as a material dimension of a phenomenon or object and its relation to human thought and practice. And architecture then becomes about imagining, transforming this relation in a specific place or building. And in this sense, materiality, he states, tells us something essential about the way we think or act. Through the lens of materiality, he questions in this evening's lecture how architecture can be political. So I would like to give the floor to Antoine Picon for his lecture. And we have asked Greet de Blok, associate professor here at the University of Antwerp, to act as his first respondent and to introduce the open discussion around with a few questions. And after this, there is some room for questions from the audience, also via the Zoom chat. So if you want to, you can ask questions to Antoine, and we will end the session around 8 o'clock. But without further ado, Antoine, I happily give you the floor.
Thank you, Prof. Okay, thank you all for having me here. In the past month, during that month, I've lectured virtually in China, Japan, and a couple of other places, but it's actually so much better to be really in Antwerp and addressing, of course, a limited audience, but still better than all these virtual. So what I'm going to present today is based really on the last chapter of the book that, you know, my introducer was kind enough to mention, The Materiality of Architecture, which is a somewhat theoretical book based, as I'll return to a somewhat peculiar or specific definition of materiality. This is still very much a work in progress, a reflection that I've begun, and I'm hoping that it will develop in the years to come. So let's begin by the question of architecture and politics. In the past years, the question of the relation between architecture and politics has made a spectacular comeback. When I arrived at the GSD at the beginning of the early 2000s, everybody was dreaming of being a Flying Dutchman like Rem Koolhaas, you know, surfing on globalization with a somewhat cynical and extremely intelligent eye. I think today there is the return of the question of how can design change the world? How can it improve the world? I think the time when globalization and the rising star system were monopolizing the attention are definitely over. So how can architecture contribute to a different future, a more just one, a more environmentally friendly, has become really a key question. This explains, in a number of places, the return of Marxist approaches. But these approaches tend very often to consider architecture as a consequence of a play of much more fundamental forces like capital, labor, etc. So is architecture capable of some kind of political agency? This is evidently not an easy question to answer. So traditionally, when dealing with such question, there were two kinds of answer. I'm simplifying, but let's say two kinds of answer. The first one had to do with a general layout or program. Architecture was political insofar that it serves specific purposes. The Forbidden City or the Castle of Versailles were definitely political in that respect, just like Bentham, Panopticon. Another way to answer this question had to do with political ideology and the way architecture could serve it through its strong symbolic dimension. From this perspective, the pyramids were political, just like the churches of the Counter-Reformation with their abundant decor. It's, by the way, interesting to note that the symbolic was generally understood as a kind of direct translation of the core values of the political regime it served. So these approaches have their interest, and we still continue to do that, to interpret very often architecture as political, following these two threads. And I don't want to discard them, but they do have a certain number of shortcomings. And these shortcomings are part of a more general question, which is how do we interpret artifacts in a political perspective? Let's start by the general layout of a project, its program. It may be more flexible than what it may seem at first. For example, there is a genealogy, I mentioned Versailles, but there is a genealogy leading from Versailles to the 19th century Fourierist phalanstery, a kind of utopian community which has nothing to do with Versailles, but is actually using the general principle of Versailles organization. If we take the symbolic, etc., in the 1930s, the so-called return to order that marked architecture, the return to a kind of neoclassical monumentality, characterized very different regimes from Berlin to Washington and from Washington to Moscow. Here, for example, this very totalitarian looking building is actually the Truman Building of 1937 in Washington. So how can architecture be political? Maybe a bit more complex than what it may seem. Above all, these two types of answer leave aside a series of other dimensions of the relation of architecture and politics. And these relations may be defined in a much broader way than through the participation of architecture to the rituals of a political regime or its capacity to express the core values of this regime. This explains for the use of actor network theory, ANT, by a number of scholars. Let me mention Albena Janeva, whose book is probably among the most significant references produced recently on the subject. For those who know the North American history of architecture scene, the contribution of the aggregate group in the United States are also very much following the same intuition. Both have contributed to expand our vision of the agency of architecture. But this is not the kind of approach I'd like to follow here, even if what I share with the ANT is with actor network theory is the necessity to expand what we call politics, to have an extended definition of politics. But what I'm actually interested in is a kind of return to two dimensions that play a fundamental role in the definition of what architecture is about. So the first are the sensation that stem from the direct encounter with buildings, the experience of surface and volume, of space, light, color, do exert an influence on us that often present, I will argue, political resonance beyond the individual character of the sensation thus aroused. Take, for instance, the feelings conveyed by elementary sequences such as doors, staircase, or windows, or the impression produced by changes in level of illumination or by effects of opacity and transparency. Le Corbusier Mill Owners, for example, appears as a magistral complication of the relation between outside and inside. Actually, for in a large number of places in this building, you do not exactly know whether you're outside or inside. And one could argue that one of the things architecture does best is actually to complicate the threshold between inside and outside. But, to take another example further in history, Schinkel's Altes Museum, in which you ascend the staircase in the dark inside the building and then emerge gradually in the light, and you pass from a relatively close vision of the stone of the staircase to the panorama of the city. I'll return to what it may mean a bit later in this conference. So sensation and what they may enable us to build. Another level for me is the symbolic and the ornamental. I'm especially interested in ornament for at least two reasons. I actually devoted a book on ornament a few years ago. Two reasons. The first is definitely the importance that it used to have in architecture. Basically, until the 19th century, no ornament, not really architecture. The second is, of course, the return of the ornamental in the digital age. We are in the middle of this strange return of the ornamental, even taking sometimes, the appearance of a kind of digital grotesque. So one thing to note is sensation, meaning, or symbols, phenomenology used to be interested in these two dimensions. So to be clear, I'm not a phenomenologist, or at least I'm a strange phenomenologist insofar that I believe that the sensory and the symbolic are not given once and for all, but they're partly cultural construct. So what I'll try to propose is actually a way of understanding sensation and symbols as cultural constructs. So for me, what is at stake, I won't expand that here, is actually the question of the relation to language. Sensation is supposed to speak, so to say, or to address us, or to affect us before language. And symbols are supposed to be post-linguistic. They very often presuppose that we have invented language. But what I will retain here is mostly the fact that architecture is, in a way, trying to suggest that matter could address us. Another way to formulate that would be to refer to the notion of animation. Architecture tries to animate matter so that it seems about to speak to us. Of course, if it spoke, it would no longer be architecture. And this animation may take very different forms from one period to another. The animation of a Baroque facade in Rome has, of course, not much to do a priori with a very different kind of animation, that of Le Corbusier at the convent of the Tourette. But what seems to me important is that architecture, as an attempt to animate matter, supposes that there may be something that circulates between matter and ourselves, between what seems the most remote from us, the thing, the stuff from which things are made, and ourselves as subject. And one of the best proof of that is, the idea for a very long time that what architecture did was to enable actually to buildings to acquire something like a face, a visage to address us, which was very often conveyed until the 19th century by the idea that even putting moldings on a facade was like enabling a building to have a face. This is actually an engraving from a Renaissance Spanish treatise on the Vitruvian principle, but this idea of actually animation that enables the building to address us in some ways is an old idea. So this is where materiality comes into play, and this is again the theme that I've tried to deal with in my most recent book. So let's not try to be too boring. So let's try to be quick. So the first thing to note is when we say that something is material, it's actually, we can touch it, or we have a fairly good, notion that it's out there. But it means actually that we relate to it in a certain way, which means, speaking of relation, that of course materials play a role, evidently. This is, of course, the Unité d'Habitation of Marseille, of Le Corbusier, and this is about things tangible. But the definition of things out there, things that appear as tangible, has varied throughout centuries and is different from one society to another. One of my favorite examples are ghosts. In the 19th century, ghosts used to be much more tangible for a lot of people than they are today. Today, if you show your friend of the photograph of a ghost, you're going to be quickly suspected of being a little bit wacky. In the 19th century, there was a whole business of taking photos of ghosts with the family that had remained on Earth. And this is, for example, one of these photos. Of course, we suppose they were fake, but, a number of people believed that actually spirit had material manifestation. Just like in the Middle Ages, miracles happened much more than today. So this leads, of course, to the idea that materiality as a relation to the physical world has changed from one period to another. Now comes the worst part, and then it will be an easy ride, which is basically the idea that materiality does not only tell us something about the world that is out there. It tells us, because it's the relation we have with this world, it tells us something about who we are. It's an old philosophical idea. Even Descartes, the most Innaist of all philosophers, had the suspicion that the way we relate to the outside world may have a relation to the way we understand ourselves. But the philosopher I like to refer to, sorry, this is in French, is actually an 18th century philosopher, Condillac, sensationalist, who imagined a pretty strange philosophical fiction. He imagined a statue, so follow me, statue, okay, which was endowed with the capacity to become conscious and to think, etc., but had no senses, so was still in limbo, so to say. And the treatise goes by giving the statue sight, hearing, taste, etc. And interestingly, the most fundamental moment in the story is actually when the statue, it's not when she begins to see, nor even to hear, it's when she begins to touch. She touches things and she realized, wow, there is something out there. And because there is something out there that resists my movement, I am in this world, but I am a subject in the world, and not everything depends on what I can do, but I can still do a number of things. So my proposal is to consider that materiality is a kind of co-emergence or co-construction, if we take it as a cultural construct up to a certain extent, of the physical world as something we can relate to up to a certain extent, and ourselves. Architecture, in other words, is about organizing our relation to the material world in a way that tells us both something about this world and about ourselves. And for me, this is, by the way, what inhabiting means. We very often hear that architecture is specific because it's about inhabiting. What does it mean to inhabit? You know, machines so far, until the day they really become sentient, they occupy space, we inhabit space, which means that actually we relate to it. We relate to the materials, the light, to the experience of warmth or cold, etc. And it tells us something about who we are. And this is what architecture is about. This is a modernist house in Honolulu, just in order to travel a little bit. It's a nostalgic take on traveling. So architecture is as much a proposal about, again, what is the nature of the world out there and who we are. So then a history of materiality becomes possible with key episodes, and some of them we know. For example, Renaissance architecture is, of course, about, hey, the world out there is measurable. And this is why we can represent it in perspective, because perspective is about measure. And as a coincidence, this is inseparable from a vision of the subject as a subject that is able to partly objectify what is out there through the use of calculation. And then again, you know, you could argue also that the mechanized society is inseparable from changes in the perception of the physical world, but also in the perception of ourselves, of our body, with a very specific mix of exhilaration, you know, think you're in a rapid car or whatsoever, the world before, as one says now in France, but still, it's still, or a motorcycle, you're accelerating, you're powerful, etc. But oops, there is an accident and you may be crushed. So this strange kind of power and vulnerability. So where do I want to go? That actually the history of architecture is also a history, up to a certain point, a history of form or regime, as I tend to call them, of materiality. And of course, today, one might argue that the environmental turn is actually a change in what we consider as tangible. For example, gradients of temperature, humidity, levels, etc., are becoming more and more tangible. This is what architects like Philippe Ram are arguing at length. And we are, of course, changing, and with all these discussion about the relation between the human, etc. Speaking of materiality, information itself tend to become more and more tangible. This is a digital water pavilion a few years ago that mixed water and information. So the real question, to go back to inhabiting, what does it mean to inhabit in such a context? What does it tell us about who we are? And I would argue that concrete architecture is to a large extent, whether we like it or not, about these questions. So I'm done. I'll return to materiality at the end of this lecture, but let me now develop two important points that should enable us to understand better what kind of agency may possess architecture beyond, programs and traditional symbolic interpretation. So let's begin by what I call from sensation to situation. The fundamental effectiveness, whatever one says of architecture, lies in its capacity to organize matter in ways that provoke sensation and generate affects that can be shared. I don't think this is rocket science. What architecture does is actually to order matter. One calls an architect fundamentally not to create space, but already to put some order to a heap of brick, stone, or concrete, etc. And the idea is that it should provoke interesting sensations. And for a large part, those sensations and affects are created by means specific to the discipline, such as the definition again of an outside and inside, a play on scale and dimension, the contrast between light and shadow, opacity of transparency, etc. So architecture can also contribute to focus the attention on specific areas. Think of the stage in theaters. The spatial resources of the discipline are, and this is where it becomes connected to materiality, they're usually mobilized in close connection with some key qualities of the materials it employs, from brick to concrete and from wood to steel. So of course, there are moments in the history of architecture in which we have a production of paper architecture, but usually architects are people who create sensation with real materials. Smoothness of roughness, grain, texture, color constitute an integral part of architectural effects, just like light. And this is probably what great architects like Kahn understood. The Exeter Library is actually very much about the contrast between concrete, brick, wood, but also shadow and light, etc. These effects, one thing to note, they're seldom univocal. They're usually obtained by combining determination that may seem mutually exclusive. Again, for example, in Le Corbusier's work, very often the notion of outside and inside are both affirmed and challenged through their unlikely blend, just like the distinction between light and shadow is often blurred. Take Villa Coruchet. I didn't bring with me a picture, but Villa Coruchet is all about a profound perturbation. You never know if you're inside or outside in such a project. So at this stage, speaking of sensation, light, etc., it would be very tempting to follow phenomenologists and to attribute to architectural sensation and affects immutable biological roots. After all, I'm on a podium, and even great apes, if a great ape goes on a stone, it tends to give more authority to the kind of discourses he or she is delivering. So why not think that it has biological root? So I don't want to deny that. But I'm always worried when one begins to find biological roots everywhere, because it tends to assimilate things which are very different, like the animal-like, the primitive and the childlike, etc. Things, assimilation we've seen in the past. And, it also very often discover that actually the non-Western are not as sophisticated as the Western tradition, etc. So I think it's more interesting to actually consider that part of that are actually social construct. And this becomes even more evident even when one begins to realize that actually the podium is not enough to really make a work of architecture. You need to combine things. You need actually to create sequences. And these sequences may become emotional itineraries, thus making possible, among other possibilities, what Le Corbusier called the architectural promenade. So, for example, one of my personal interpretation of the Villa Savoye in relation with mechanization is actually that the Villa Savoye is a giant speed reducer. Le Corbusier was obsessed by speed. and thinking that speed introduced a new dimension in human life, but incompatible, at least so it seemed, with a traditional rhythm of life. So if you look, Villa-Savoie is a place in which you're supposed to arrive very quickly, 100 kilometers per hour, which was, the top speed at the time. So with a car, and then you park, and then you begin to walk, and you ascend the ramp, and you slow down, and you slow even more until you reach the solarium, in which you all of a sudden can become immobile and be actually in contact with nature. You rediscover the wind, you rediscover the sun, etc., etc. And so that actually architecture proposes literally a kind of reconciliation between mechanical speed and the rhythm of tradition. So, and then you could also interpret the Altes Museum in this, not in the same light, of course. This is not about the automobile, but this is about sociability. This is about ascending from shadow to light, but also discovering art and sharing the meaning of art. And as you may see, there are groups there. The building plays a lot with the figure of gemelity, of twins. And so there are groups in which art becomes a conversation, a mutual initiation, etc. So this has been studied at length by historians of art, such as Barry Bergdahl. But to make a long story short, what it does create by the end are what I call situations. Situations which is mean as, a convergence of affects, sensation, etc., that creates a platform for possibilities. A platform for possibilities. It doesn't mean that architecture will force you to do something, but it will enable you to think about doing something. To take another example, more recent, this is a friend and a colleague of mine at Harvard, Raoul Mehrotra, and this is what he likes to call a smart facade in India. It's a smart facade because it's actually a lot of smart human beings who tend the garden, the planted garden. But the thing that this building makes possible actually is not really understandable for someone usually who doesn't know India, is that on one side of the window, you have .com people, you have actually startupper, etc. On the other hand, on the other side, you have people whose caste is much lower. And usually these people ignore each other. There, architecture suggests that they could become mutually visible, which is actually in India not a given. So just like in a less dramatic way, when Ginny Gang at the Aqua Tower tried to organize the balconies so that people, instead of being in their own apartment, seeing no one else, can see each other, architecture proposes possibilities, creates what I call situation. So this is, by the way, for me, the perspective from which the Panopticon, the famous Panopticon of Bentham, should be re-examined. As you all know, or may remember, the Panopticon, there is a central observation point, but the prisoners do not know whether there is really someone, which means that actually this is an organization that suggests something, but it leaves, it's a bit more open than what it may be. So back to so in some ways, my proposition is that from sensation, architecture constructs situation, and situation have political possibilities, like in India or etc. So architecture, uses again chains of sensation and affect, but they may be, for example, also linked to rhythm. Architecture is linked to the rhythm of our lives. And this is also something which is deeply political. So I've studied that. This is a little bit for grit, but I think this is something also that characterizes part of urban design and urban art, which is part of what design does is to create situation. And you could actually argue that the parks and gardens of Haussmannian Paris are also actually means to create situations. And, even with a park I've studied at length, the Butte Chaumont, which suggests that actually the city should function like a garden insofar that it creates an urban situation. And actually, interestingly, the guy who designed the Butte Chaumont was also the guy who actually designed part of the new avenues of Haussmann. And then this is linked to the idea that the city should be a kind of civilizing machine. There again, not forcing people, but suggesting, prodding, etc. So that was the first moment of what I wanted to say tonight. And yes, I won't be like the bad French. I think I should be not too long. I'm on time. So let me move to my second point, which is ornament and decor. Strangely, especially in France, when I wrote my book on ornament, there were a lot of people who thrown at me, how can you write on things which are still so frivolous? The French are still very much, this kind of neo-modernist thing. Forgetting that actually for centuries, architecture was evidently political through ornament, because ornament carried a symbolic content, but a symbolic content that had to do with social hierarchy. If you saw that on a house, it meant that it was a noble family, which had in addition given a cardinal to the church. This is in Italy, etc. So ornament and social hierarchy were intimately linked. So, of course, ornament, because of postmodernism and a couple of other moments, there have been probably a number of misunderstandings of how ornament functions. So part of it was, of course, behind postmodernism, also the fact that we still have the trauma of the 19th century. This is actually a great sculptor, Carpeaux, but this is one of his worst creations, which is the frontispice of one of the pavilions of the Tuileries. It still exists today, and that's the French Empire protecting agriculture and the sciences, as you may. So the agriculture is the guy with the bull, and the sciences on the other side. It's clearly, yes, that's a bit difficult to defend. I agree. But this is forgetting that probably true ornament in architecture is a bit more complicated than that. True ornament, to try to make that conspicuous, let me just propose a reflection on the ionic order versus the caryatide. The ionic order is a becoming like a female body of a column. Still following me? It doesn't look like a female body. It's actually a column that is actually inspired by the proportion of the female body. So at least go the Vitruvian tradition. Very slender female, of course, and is actually a kind of in the process of emerging as a female, the suggestion of a female body. Whereas the caryatide has become a fully fledged female body. And it's a much more limited thing. Caryatide, 5 or 6 caryatide is a good business. 200 caryatide becomes Las Vegas, which means that by the end, this is architecturally much more limited in use. That's something that is more restrained. So all that to say that the symbolic in architecture, contrary to the postmodern hypothesis, did not function like words in the dictionary. Actually, the symbolic in architecture is the emergence of the possibility of meaning. Another way to understand that, going back to Barthes and others, would be to understand the symbolic as a process of substituting something present for the absence of something else. The ionic column is not a female body, but it's suggesting that a female body could become present. But actually the female body is not there, whereas the caryatide is stuck into its being like a female body. So ornament was in something we've forgotten for a very long time, seen as something dynamic, analogous to a kind of unfolding, which is where, of course, the postmodern made a mistake. This building, I agree, is problematic. So ornament in architecture embodied, by the way, a certain capacity of the discipline to move within striking contradiction. On the one hand, it was ruled, it was conventional, and on the other hand, it was irreducible to a static vocabulary. And we find there the ambiguous relation of architecture to rules, but also to question of expression and language. Architecture is not a language. It's moving in the direction of language. It's a kind of process again of unfolding. And there comes an additional complication, which is what did ornament at a larger scale? It coordinated with other ornaments. It coordinated also with the general organization, the ordering of matter, and it created what I would call a décor. A décor, which is something immersive, something that orient, and probably where it becomes complicated, something that suggests that it is meaningful, but is not necessarily decipherable by everyone. In other words, architecture suggests that there may be a meaning somewhere, but doesn't tell you exactly, contrary to a book that you can read, what is this meaning. So, which is for me, with all modesty, I profoundly disagree with Victor Hugo. Gothic cathedrals were never books. They actually suggested, of course, if you were a deeply erudite person, you could, between quotes, quote unquote, read the scenes on the portals, etc. But most people didn't do that. And we are, as Westerner, we can be struck by Aryan temples in India and not know what they're depicting. But we know they suggest that this is meaningful because it's coordinated, because things assemble together, etc., etc. So I think what architecture does is actually, and décor has always a kind of scenery connotation, as if architecture proposed a stage for human action. And by the way, if you take Versailles, there again, you can decipher Versailles literally, you know, because God knows there was a special group attached to organizing the symbolic program, etc. But, you know, most people who go in the Salon de la Guerre do not perceive all these details. What they perceive is the immersive environment that creates certain impressions, etc. So architecture, for me, constitutes literally a stage. That's to say, I think the most profound political resonance of architecture has to do with the fact that it does not necessarily tell you what to do, but it tells you that whatever you do, it has a relevance. So architecture creates the possibility of a human world, which goes back to this idea of inhabiting. If you inhabit, it means that you have a place, which means that what you do matters. And we'll go back very literally. And I think this is what architecture does. So architecture is political insofar that it suggests that actually human life has a relevance, that it's not, you know, something purely biological that happened, is that there is something that is made possible through it. And by the way, situation and décor often work together. A good example of that is the famous Garnier vestibule of the opera. You know, one of the greatest moments of Garnier was to understand that actually in the Paris opera, the vestibule was as important as the theater itself, that it was the true stage. And actually the whole scenario unfolds in which the situation where you see what you see, etc., is inseparable from the lavish ornamentation. Perhaps a bit hard to digest today, but that's another story. For me, by the way, one of the questions of today is that ornament has returned, but maybe décor, as something politically loaded, has not yet returned. So the question of, you know, how do we transform the concrete decorative, digital decorative into a true décor, is social décor, is a question. So where do I want to go? And with all that, probably with the following idea, which is in a way very simple, that of course architecture may help this or that regime by organizing rooms in a stately way, or hospital in a certain way, or prisons in another way, etc. That is political for sure. Architecture may have extremely heavy symbols. For example, I always remember, you know, the American embassy in London with a huge eagle on the top. So, okay, that's political. But I'm not sure that we're at the core of architecture, of what architecture can do best. What architecture can do best is actually organize interesting situations, organize situations that suggest possibilities. I'll come back to that. And it can generate decor that go further by suggesting that these possibilities have a meaning, just like a theater stage. To go back to the theater stage, for me, one of the most profound things architecture does is because, and it's not exactly the podium or the stone that we see, for example, in 2001, in which one of the apes goes in the stone, because it suggests actually that there is a narrative possible, that there is a shared destiny, etc. So it's a bit more complicated. So situation and decor are for me two essential aspects of what I call a politics of materiality, which is not without analogy with the aesthetic regimes of Jacques Rancière. That is to say, the way we organize what Rancière called the distribution of the sensible, so probably materiality is a distribution of the tangible, of what we consider as the tangible. And for me, materiality is a simultaneous organization of the tangible out there and who we think we are. We never know. Probably to be human is to be actually very uncertain about what it means to be human. That's probably one of the few things that characterize the human. So Renaissance architecture is, of course, deeply political. It created situation and decor that had, of course, a relation with the affirmation, among other things, of civic values, of modern civic values. This is Brunelleschi Hospital in Florence, which is a complete reshaping of the hospital as a public monument, etc. Architecture, by the way, saying that, you can actually use it to do very bad things. And let's not forget that actually one Speer architecture is evidently political, as a remarkable proposal, remarkable between brackets, deserving notice, regarding the relation between the material world and human subjectivity. It's an architecture at its best that enroll concrete and stone, light and darkness in a complex game that is supposed to exalt the raw forces of a telluric nature, the Reich as a natural creation, in a complex game that also miraculously aligned with cutting-edge militaristic technology. And this is also something that proposes that certain subjects, like the Führer and the dignitaries, are much higher than others. Key group from elite troops to German athletes, belittling others. So one of the sad things to say is that totalitarian regime, have no difficulty usually finding their architects. So I'll come back to that, but that's one of the problematic aspects of the discipline, which then enables me to say that Le Corbusier, in that respect, was never a fascist in that tradition, because fascism goes usually, though it's supposed to exalt the power of everyone, there are still people higher than other. Modernism was, on the other hand, based on the ambition to treat everyone with equal dignity. This is actually back to the Villa Savoye, but this is the house of the gardener. And the lesson is that the gardener is also entitled to architectural elegance, just like the boss. So, which is a very different vision of the world. So that leads to difficult questions. So, for example, can we talk of a truly democratic architecture? You know, totalitarian architecture, we know what it is, unfortunately. Democratic architecture, that has been a recurring quest of architects throughout the past centuries. And today, you have a lot of discourses about how to create empowering public spaces, etc. But again, the risk is to believe that architecture, if you construct a prison, yes, you can force people. If you want to construct a platform for freedom, it gets more complicated. And there is no absolute clear recipe for situation and decor. So in the late 18th century, you know, people in France had a great idea, not only in France, let's resurrect the Greco-Roman theater as a marker of democracy. And this is when, by the way, the traditional disposition of parliaments as two rows facing each other was replaced in countries ranging from France to the United States by theater-like rooms. But one thing to note is that it did not mean always that, you know, you created democracy with these beautifully designed parliaments. And in addition, the oldest, probably one of the oldest democracy in the world, the United Kingdom, remained faithful to the medieval disposition of parliamentary debates. So does a democratic architecture exist? In Washington, D.C., you know, which is probably the only place where Wisconsin is written on top of a Doric Greek column, they also believe that you could create a democratic decor. But as I argued at the beginning, is that much more democratic than, you know, decors that you find in the USSR at the same moment? This is complex. So again, we may have to accept that design suggests design prods, design orients in certain direction, but design, when used in a positive way, is rarely constraining. You cannot constrain people through design to act virtuously. The only thing you do is you construct a prison. So, which means that for designer, the political is a complex question because you don't save the world with design. You announce the possibility of salvation, which is not exactly the same. And people may refuse to be saved. There may be, by the end, more urgent task for design than being democratic. For example, with sustainability, we may have to actually, I think one of the fundamental questions is actually how to make the future appealing, how to make frugality something appealing. You know, and it's not necessarily by greening artificially and using plants as a kind of bizarre ornament that you're really going to solve the question, because actually this is more complex than that. It may have to do with redefining what design condition in which frugality can be a truly enriching experience, which is, by the way, one of the things modernity was pretty good about, the kind of austerity, but the joyful austerity of modernity. So how can we construct situation and decors that points toward a different future? So of course, it's almost unavoidable that the utopian may reappear. And I think, you know, we've lived a period in which realism, bordering the cynical, was the norm. And now we're really trying to reinvent something like hope that very often goes. Let's not forget that Ernst Bloch defined a long time ago utopia as a principle for hope. So we are trying to reinvent some utopian connotation for design. But probably Tafuri was right when he pointed out that modernity had failed in that respect because it had tried to become an active tool for rationalization. And this is what architecture and utopia is about. You know, the utopia, perhaps the utopia of modernism was to make architecture efficient, just like in engineering. Perhaps design is never truly efficient. Design belongs to a different category because efficiency goes with a kind of idea of constraining, like machine-like functioning. Perhaps what architecture again can do is try to open possibilities, endless possibilities. Probably more generally, I would say the attempts to use design as a way to save the world may be more dangerous than anything else. Probably we should rather imagine an architecture of endless possibilities. And so that was probably the modernist dream. Probably we may have to rediscover some ideas. I spoke of situation. Of course, it has some relation with the situationist, and how not to mention with this slide, the New Babylon of Constant, in which Constant tried to imagine what if urban design could become just a platform for endless, unbounded, positive possibilities. And on that, I think, yes, I've been reasonably long, but not too long, I hope, and I'll conclude there. Thank you very much.
Check. Thank you. I will just open the floor, both here and online, and I would invite our colleague de Blok to maybe start with a few questions. And I'm just going to give you the microphone, or how should we? That's true. Maybe it's easier if you both sit in front.
Okay. All right. All right. Antoine, many thanks for the exciting lecture, very resounding materials. So what I was going to do now is ask you a few questions as kind of opening shots also for the audience to discuss the themes which featured in your lecture. So I wanted to start with politics and with the very intriguing, or as I understood it, and in any case, this kind of intriguing dialogue relation that you set up between the sensitive and the rational, and that you also show that there are many theories in which the rational is prominent, like the Foucauldian perceptions, power, ideological ways to deal with architecture and how it should articulate sociopolitical projects and priorities. And then on the other spectrum, on the other end of the spectrum, you have the sensitive, and then the theories of effect, and almost excluding the rational from the equation, and vice versa. And you set up this intriguing interplay between the two. And I think they're right. Yeah, okay. Oh, that's good. So, but I think like when I look at more Marxist theory, there are a few authors that also set up this relation between the sensitive and the rational, and then also connect the political to that relation, to the event. Like they define the political as a kind of a disruptive event, kind of not staging possibility, but staging the struggle for equality, for claiming rights. And I was wondering whether architecture could, because they don't relate it to architecture, of course. But I was wondering what your thoughts were on that. Do you think that it could go further than staging possibilities? That it could stage kind of the disruptive political event, that it could be designed in that way?
That's a difficult question. I knew I was running into serious danger with you, Brett. Yes and no, which is a way to escape the difficulty. Let's go back to the metaphor of the theater, which I appreciate. A stage doesn't tell you exactly what kind of play is going to be performed, but certain theater go usually with certain types of play. So I think, once again, I think for the better and for the worse, what can architecture do is suggest, is it does not construct the narrative. And by the way, nobody has ever been able to solve the conundrum of what is a truly unexpected event. How do you construct the possibility of a truly unexpected event? That's actually, that's actually undoable. If it's really unexpected, you cannot even, but strangely, that's the power of architecture, because architecture is not something, is not a kind of, it's not staging, the play is not written, so the unexpected can happen. And by the way, this is the power of public space. You may remember, you know, for example, the Arab Spring and a number of things happen still in very classic public spaces because there is some degree of indetermination. And I think strangely, I would say most people who thought of architecture as political have tried to build upon determination. And my argument is to say that if you try to build on determination, you end up doing prisons of some kind or another. You have to build on indetermination, strangely. And then the unexpected may happen. But it doesn't mean that it has to be irrational. I believe that architecture is a mix, is actually much more rational than what one imagined, but it's simply not, I think at its best, it creates possibilities again. And it orients these possibilities. There is a certain degree of orientation. You know, in a lavish, you know, counter-reform church, you know, it suggests certain things and not others. In, you know, more austere venues, you know, that's an other type of suggestion. It also creates different relation to the body. I think also, you know, architecture is by the end also something we inhabit with a body, which is also a very powerful thing. But if you try too much to constrain the body, again, you create shackles. So we have to accept that, which is difficult these days because, you know, in these times of severe crisis, we'd like so much to have solutions.
Absolutely.
When I'm in my very provocative move, I say, if you want to save the world, be an engineer. If you want to give meaning to the world, be an architect. But that's when I'm doing provocation.
Yeah, so that perfectly ties in with the next question.
Okay.
So it's about scaling up. So it's about, does it work in the same way in urban design? And I think you already gave an answer with the public square, because if you come together and organize a revolution on a public square, it has meaning, it generates meaning. They do it on a public square because it generates meaning. So it really underlines what you concluded. But do urban designers have more instruments? Do engineers of infrastructure have more instruments to scale?
I think certain things are scalable, others not. Clearly, you know, I think there again, you know, if you try to construct, you know, a concentration camp, this is relatively, then you can construct cities as, you know, camps, and that will work. If you want to create a city for the unexpected, the possibly democratic, the surging of energies, collective energies, becomes more complex, but you can probably create squares, etc., in which people have the impression, it may not be, by the way, necessarily a square in which you'd like to stroll or whatever, but it's a square in which you have the impression if you come there, it might be important. So I think there are possibilities in urban design. They're not, and also in landscape and in the way we conceive the place of nature in cities, etc. But it's true that the more you scale up, the more you dissolve partially the very strong link with the human body, with the human sensation, etc. You know, the most powerful urban composition very often, you know, like Renaissance Italian cities or etc., they're in some ways giant interiors. So it becomes more complicated at larger scales, but you gain other things. You know, I think we have to recognize also that in design, there is sometimes the ideology that at every scale we do the same thing. No, we don't do the same thing at every scale. We exert different types of suggestion and power.
And the sequence, of course.
But strangely, I started actually by thinking a little bit about infrastructure, because, you know, I started from the famous debate, you know, do artifacts have politics, you know, with the bridges of Moses, etc. You know, a classic polemics, you know, in which, you know, Moses designed bridges which were too low so that buses for working class and Black people could not go under. And there's been a raging controversy about this interpretation of infrastructure, etc. Even infrastructure are much more, you know, open. I think objects, strangely, you know, it's, for me, why is it that objects are so suggestive and at the same time so enigmatic in what they suggest? It's for me still a motive of puzzlement.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I have a final question about authorship. Well, as architects, is the architect with a capital A, is he still alive, or did we bury him or her?
Well, the period is full of paradoxes, you know, you know, I remember, so 15 years ago, people were announcing with the down of the internet, etc., the return to the collective author, etc., the end of authorship as we know it. Truth is, in most of the arts, we've seen a winner takes all story, in which, you know, a few people, Adele recently, music, in pop music, Rem Koolhaas and others, etc., were pretty much taking it all. I do believe, strangely, I believe in authorship insofar. I have a certain belief in authorship, but I think we have also to accept that authorship may be truly collective or network-like, and no longer, I think the star system is going to die in some ways, but at some point, or at least there will always be star architects. I have no problem with that, but it may be less the kind of ideal regime of the profession, that we need probably to reinvent other forms of collective and network thing, which doesn't mean the end of authorship. I think in some ways, you know, when we have no authorship, usually it shows. And, you know, if we have no authorship, why have design school, frankly? So, you know, we could have just, you know, building engineering school in which you would learn to put together things. So I think we need some form of authorship, but we need to redefine authorship. So it may look a bit curious, but that's what I think. And probably, but we're not yet there, get out of a regime, the kind of winner takes all thing, we're beginning to see the limits of it in some ways.
Absolutely. Are there questions from the audience?
And you have also to check on the chat. Yes. The wires.
I'm going to stand here, Anton. I was, it was a really nice lecture. What I was a bit puzzled with is the analogy that you make with the stage. Because the stage is something that is actually very amaterial. So it has a background, which is basically cardboard, painted something on it. So then I was wondering, like, where is then, so what is the architecture, like the arrangement of spaces or the sizes? And if people can be fooled by a stage, what is then really the role of materiality? That is something that is also sometimes puzzles me, like what is distinctive about materiality versus in general architecture?
Oh, you got me there. I think I'm thinking of this. I think probably I'm thinking of the stage as probably two things. It's true that I thought a lot about the Olympic theater or even a Greco-Roman stage in which you have a permanent decor. But the first thing I retain from the stage is a spatial situation. You know, this is an elevated platform, and there is actually there is a space organized that converges visually towards the elevated platform, which for me is a kind of situation. You know, I think one of the things architecture does is actually to suggest ways of looking at things. You know, just like, you know, to go back to Le Corbusier, you know, it's very striking at La Tourette, for example, there are moments in which actually he put little obstacles so that you see the landscape only in a certain way and not others, etc. So it's not very democratic for sure, but it suggests a certain way of seeing. It's true that there is no decor. So actually I would use it probably more as a situation than a decor, but very often we decorate it later. But, you know, even when it's dark, we take it as a stage, which is also, you know, the strange thing with decor is that it can be very minimal. But what we have to believe is that actually things converge. I had an interesting conversation about the book the other day, and I realized that actually what I believe by the end about design is that design is about ordering. I may be a neo-Vitruvian without, I realized that, you know, the modernists believe it was space, etc. I believe more profoundly it has to do with strangely order and symbols. Which may be a kind of strange return to the Vitruvian. I don't know. I hope not, but who knows? No, Vitruvius was not French. So, and you know, the Dutch, look at Antwerp. It's full of, you know, it's full of Baroque churches and a number of things like that. So, you know, speaking of decor, I think Antwerp is a really interesting city. It's an urban, it has a number of spectacular urban decor. So that would be the beginning of the answer, but that was a good argument. I agree.
Thank you for the lecture. But I'm a bit confused, maybe a bit on the one hand, reference to Janiva.
Really? Sorry?
Albina Janiva, with her mapping of controversies to which you refer to and the actor network approaches. And on the other hand, what I would observe as a rather detached view to architecture, to use Dewey. So if you say that architecture is about organizing our relationship with matter on the one hand, and on the other, the narrative about, or discourse about decor and decor as kind of suggestion. Suggestion is very semiotic. So it is you there, architecture, and you talk to me, or I see you, architecture, and I use it. So for me, this is quite near to a kind of dichotomy of body and mind, again, the matter and the mind. or the atmosphere. And Janeva, and I think also Latour says that this is the problem, that we should get rid of this kind of dichotomy, and instead of considering architecture as a mix of both ends, that will never work. We should try to keep these things together, which means that you, just as driving a car is the best as soon as you dissociate from the car and just drive it, that the architecture disappears. We are just in architecture. I would say that teaching architecture for students, in order to do it differently than the type that has caused the problem, would rather focus on this dissociation than on kind of explicit presence and detachment.
Two things. The first on Albena, who's a very good friend. What I share with people from ANT is the idea that we need to expand the political. Let's say the political is not only a question of parties, it's how we relate to each other, how we relate to, you know, as the ANT people would say, non-humans, etc. So that's where I completely converge. What I'm trying to do is in some ways still try to think about what is the agency in some ways of the person who designs. As I say, for me, which is still a concern. And it's interesting that Janeva book, which I was referring to, was not the mapping controversies. It's 5 ways for buildings to be political. And in some ways, she deals with buildings. And I'm more interested in architects in some ways. So, and how do, or let's say, how do designers produce certain types of effect, etc. That said, I took the material, you know, the situation and the decor in an analytic way. In practice, they're most of the time completely inseparable. So it doesn't mean necessarily that you have to separate the body and the mind. To take an example, you know, is an elevated podium a stage, to go back? Is it something that is a situation, or is it already something that is symbolic? It's probably both. So I believe, so simply I tend to dissociate the two things, but more for the sake of explaining them. But I think in practice, they're combined. And, you know, it's rare, you know, you don't begin a design by saying, I'm going to do a decor. It may happen, but it's rare. You begin by actually doing both. So even the most extravagant decor has actually, God knows, Antwerp really, it strikes me every time, you know, it already at the station, speaking of decor, you know, your station is the most extravagant railway decor I've seen in Europe, probably, you know, but it's also a situation in some ways, you know, in relation to the city, to etc. It's a little bit like Garnier. You have the impression, by the way, arriving in by railway in an opera house, so which is kind of unique in its respect. Yeah, and so I think actually you don't need necessarily to resurrect a partition, because in some ways, for me, the symbolic is not necessarily mental. Strangely, I think the big mistake, it is mental insofar, you know, is language mental? Or is it something that actually mixes both the physical, you know? For me, the symbolic is not necessarily, it's related to this term architects these days don't like, which is meaningfulness. You know, what it, you know, which is what does it, you know, it suggests that there is something that is meaningful. And I like, by the way, that in English, you say it matters. To say that something is meaningful, which for me means precisely that there is a kind of indistinction between the two. But no, I'm actually not very interested in, you know, the post-Cartesian, etc., which I think for me, one of the reasons I have a strange relation to also the post-human, etc. I think we feed on fiction about who we are, because truth is we don't know. And I think architecture is a way to stabilize partially who we think we are. And that's among the things it does, which is what I call also to inhabit. To inhabit is to try to stabilize this compound of flesh, behavior, and acquired, etc., things that we call a human in some ways. Strangely, to go back to your question, I think the most difficult is actually to create the expected. The unexpected very often, you know, look at the past 2 years. I think we've been reminded that the unexpected is extremely present. And, you know, you could say that architecture is also about building the expected. And politics maybe could be defined as the art of the expected unexpectable. Because you don't want something, you know, a revolution is unexpected, but it's an expectable unexpected. Whereas COVID was really unexpected.
It coincides with politics if both are aimed at stabilizing the
It
expected
doesn't
unexpected.
cover, no, it doesn't cover the whole of politics, clearly. I think architecture, you know, my aim was more modest. It was to say architecture may have a political relevance that goes beyond, you know, translating political programs in stone or concrete, or, you know, precisely ornamenting in the, you know, in symbolic, etc. And this is why I introduced this notion of situation and decor. I don't want to say that everything is reducible to that, just like all that we are is not reducible to the way we inhabit spaces. There again, architecture does only what it can do, and it doesn't save the world. Again, there was a question there.
Yes, I have a question about the opposite. Can space be made apolitical? Because we have a PhD student who is doing a research on neutralization of space. And he argues, well, it's in Egypt, that the government creates a lot of neutralized public spaces, like lawns where you don't walk on, or settlements where a lot of things are forbidden. So I was wondering what you think about, can spaces be apolitical? And on the several levels, from the interior, like in the one settlement, even the furniture is obliged by the government and provided. So can it on all the levels, from the interior until the urban design and urban planning, made apolitical or neutral?
Thank you for this question, because this is the only one in which I have a simple answer. My answer is no.
Not a good question.
It's no. A couple of things. I don't believe that architecture can be apolitical. And usually when it's apolitical, it's political in the sense of Albert Speer. And if you look at Egypt, the least one can say it's closer in many respects to a totalitarian regime than anything else. So I don't think that lawns on which you cannot walk are apolitical. They are deeply political, but more in the kind of prescriptive prison mode or camp mode. So that would be my answer. And I'm using that also to say that I'm a kind of anti-Olgiati. I don't believe that architecture can be completely autoreferential. I think Olgiati is confusing two things, which is, you know, the kind of cut and paste of, you know, symbolic elements that postmodernism was into, and the fact that, you know, architecture for me has to be meaningful, but to be meaningful goes beyond architecture. If architecture was conveying only, hey, I'm a cube, I don't think we would be very much interested in it. So my answer is no, there is no possibility for architecture to be apolitical completely, because to be apolitical would be to abandon every pretension to say something about human relations. And I think when you design, you always have a certain ideas of what human relations are.
So it can it be neutralized? Because that's not completely the same, eh? Neutralized and apolitical.
That I don't know. I think you can do bad architecture And so I think very often when it's neutralized, it's never completely neutralized, actually. Architecture can become, for example, a purely quantitative investment of capital circuits around the world, which is a different story. It's not apolitical there again, but architecture becomes just a commodity. And then actually, is it still architecture? Is it what we're interested in? Is piling up, empty apartments in a tower in the Gulf for actually Chinese or Russian investor to stash money? Is it really what we call design? Or is it, what Harvey would call, the kind of spatialization of capital, etc. So I would say usually when people say they're neutral, it's usually when they're the most political. But,
Thank you.
But that's my belief. And then
I was wondering, it's actually a bit related to what Irene was discussing, the paradox of the stage, and when she was saying that, the stage as a decor can fool people, can fool spectators. I was wondering, in developing your argument about the decor, what was the place of in this tension between rationalism and fiction, and the place of the simulacre, because to me décor also brings the idea of, you talked about it with the postmodern reinterpretation of the cariatide. It also brings out the idea of pastiche and of fakeness, if I may say so. It's not a very directed question. I just wanted to hear you about.
It's a good question. I think architecture has a difficult relation to truth. Clearly, and in a design school, usually an exciting discourse is always better than a truthful one, which is why engineers are so often unhappy, because engineers are those slightly utopian people who believe that the world is in black and white. And usually architects introduce all kinds of interesting grays, so that by the end you no longer know completely, but which is not fake truth. Let's be honest. Fake truth is black and white again. I think there again, I always give as an example Sullivan's Wainwright building, in which one column out of two has no steel. But the column without steel is useful to convey not the reality of the steel construction, but the rhythm, the staccato, if you like, of the industrial age and the age of steel. So I think, yes, there is always in the decor the risk of the simulacrum, but let's not forget that the origin of the symbolic is actually something that is present to represent something that is not there. So, and this is the origin of the monument. Somebody, something, a battle is not there, no longer there, etc. The person may be dead or whatever. And there is this stone or this monument that is telling us that precisely it's about absence. So, which is the paradox on which Eisenman has elaborated at length. How can architecture be both the very art of presence and something that is permeated by absence? Which is why, again, he used Derrida, because actually because text, according to Derrida, have the same capacity. Though I believe that architecture is masterful in, combining absence and presence. So yes, there is always the risk of the simulacrum. And there is always the risk that actually the decor is going to lure you into, because we want to believe. And the most striking thing for me is, even when there is no decor in a kind of country theater staging, etc., we end up imagining that there is a palace in the background, or that the sea is actually close to where the actors are playing. Because we have this formidable imagination, and even if there is no physical decor, we're able to build one. So, and architecture is, yes, architecture plays on that also. you know, which is for me the big difference with the kind of Victor Hugo thing, which really goes with the idea that you're going to read a building. But actually, I remember even when I was young and, you know, really trying to make a difference in the world, which is long gone, and when I was reading the guide, you know, line after line, and then at the right portal on the second row, you see the damned, which are about to enter hell, and then over that, you have the angel of, you know, I could do one portal, but never two. So, you know, you used to have these guides, you know, these incredible guides who describe you everything, but actually this does not convey the immersive, which goes back to what you said about distraction, which is the Benjaminian thing, you know, the strength of architecture is also that we perceive it in a certain state of distraction.
Yeah, or if the ghost audience has a question, we can, I don't know, because we didn't give them a chance. No? Okay. Okay. Yeah, thank you for your marvelous lecture. That's the first thing I wanted to say. And then it's a very contemporary thing because I feel society these days is very much obsessed with certainty, because there is so much uncertainty around. We have this pandemic, we have this amount of information. We've got this huge army of architects constructing, sometimes echoing each other. And then on the other hand, you have got really the quest for certainty that some people find in the digitalized world. We can really mold reality towards our utopias or towards our aspirations. And I'm really wondering if we're not entering an era in which architecture again becomes the place of certainty, exactly because it exists and exactly because it crystallizes or
That's a good point. I actually believe that one of the reasons architecture needs to remain material, and this is where I separate myself from the new materialist conversation we had prior to this, is because I do think that the materiality of architecture forces it to be unpredictable in some way, strangely, you know, or what I mean, partly uncontrollable. Architecture puts matter into order of march, but matter still resists. And by the end, you know, I think the physical, it's true that the digital goes with a kind of dream of overdetermination. But then the physical world is there to remind us that we have a body, that we are not even able to control sometimes our body and the needs of our bodies, etc. And I think architecture is strangely about control, but also about our impossibility to control everything, beginning with ourselves. So I believe that actually the materiality of architecture, and for me, it's interesting, by the way, that the digital has been accompanied by such a return, a strong return to the material, as if, you know, the digital had created its antidote. That actually, you know, some 20 years ago, 25 years ago, Bill Mitchell was still advocating, you know, designers to go all digital, etc., you know, organizing the virtual worlds to come. And we're realizing more and more that actually the real, you know, if you look at the world, the real limits of this world, the place where it really matters is actually the physical. You know, the digital, we know that we can do a lot of things, but, you know, I very often say, you know, take even teaching. We know we can do a ton of things on Zoom, but then the question is, what should we still continue to do in person? What is unique? What is, etc., irreplaceable? So I think the physical is actually, you know, one of the strengths of architecture is actually, because very often architecture complain that it's an archaic art, you know, it's not as hype as, you know, genetic modification or advanced algorithmic stuff. But actually piling up bricks is actually a good antidote sometimes from the impression of over control, which goes also with an impression of irreality. So both go together. So, you know, the digital world is both the world of control and the world in which fake news and rumors and, you know, all kinds of conspirational beliefs are unleashed without any control. So I think there is a future for architecture in that respect, that actually there is still a future to pile up bricks, which is very retrograde. I agree.
I think that I can speak on behalf of the faculty and particularly of the research group, only van de Velde, but also of the audience online and here. Also for the students, I think, for the marvelous masterclass and the elite that had the honor to be part of this masterclass. To thank you very much for the lecture and all the input this afternoon. Thank you.
Limited reality, but the good one. It's still better than. Yeah.